My son asked me to write a will, just in case. He thought he could sell my house and throw me out, but he didn't know who really owned the property. And when the buyers came, my son was humiliated. I had just finished tidying the kitchen when Daniel came in. He didn't knock, not that he ever really did, but today his presence felt heavier, deliberate. He leaned against the doorway, folding his arms, tilting his head in that casual way he always did when he was trying to appear harmless while demanding something. "Mom," he said, voice light, too light, "I think it's time you made a will, just in case." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. My hands, which had been wiping the last of the plates, faltered. I stared at him, my mouth suddenly dry, my heart slamming against my ribs as if warning me of what I already knew. My own son was thinking of my death as an opportunity. "Why now?" I asked, turning slowly to face him, keeping my voice steady, though I could feel it wobble just beneath the surface. "Oh, you know," he said, waving a hand as if brushing off my question. "Life's unpredictable. It's practical. The house, the land, everything should be settled while it's still simple. Otherwise, it could get messy." I could see it in his eyes, the calculating spark, the eagerness hidden beneath that thin veil of concern. He wasn't worried about me. He was imagining what belonged to him and how soon he could claim it. I wanted to shout, to tell him he was too young to think in terms of ownership over a life, over a home built with decades of my care. But instead, I folded the towel and placed it neatly on the counter. "I'll think about it," I said, voice calm, but inside a storm raged. He smiled, relieved, kissed the top of my head, and left the room whistling. His steps receded, leaving a hollow echo in my chest. I sank into the chair by the window and let the silence of the house surround me. My cat jumped onto my lap, curling against me like a warm shadow. She purred softly, a small comfort, though it could not soothe the ache that Daniel's words had left behind. I thought of the years I had spent raising him, the nights I had stayed awake by his bedside when fever burned his skin, the meals I had prepared while exhausted, the sacrifices I had made so he could have shoes, books, and schooling. And now he was speaking of a will, as if all that love and care was irrelevant, as if he already owned what was mine. The kettle hissed on the stove. I poured myself tea and sipped slowly, letting the warmth settle into my hands. But the bitterness in the liquid mirrored the bitterness swelling in my chest. 72 years, so much given, and now measured, already calculated by the eyes of the child I had raised. Later, he returned, stopping by under the pretense of checking in. His gaze drifted around the rooms, lingering on the grandfather clock, the oak dining table, the china cabinet. He was cataloging everything, as if claiming it before the papers were signed. "Do you need anything, Mom?" he asked, the casualness of his tone betraying the truth. He thought he might. "No," I said firmly. "I have everything I need." He smiled, leaned in, pressed his lips briefly to my head, and left. The gesture should have been comforting, but it felt cold, ceremonial, almost mocking. I stayed in the chair long after he was gone, watching the autumn sunlight scatter across the garden. The leaves drifted lazily, oblivious to the turmoil inside me. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house settle around me. Its creaks and sighs, which had always been comforting, now reminded me that this home, my sanctuary, was the very thing he wanted to claim. I turned to the cat curled at the foot of the bed, whispering into the darkness. "He thinks I'm already gone." The words felt heavy, but true. He believed I would step aside, that I would let my life, my home, and my dignity be handed to him without resistance. I clenched my fists beneath the covers and felt the first pulse of defiance. Let him believe what he wants. Let him think he owns what is mine. The day would come when he would see the truth, and I would be ready. I had begun noticing little signs long before Daniel's will suggestion, little things that now, in retrospect, painted the picture clearly. The way he lingered at the dining table longer than necessary, scanning the corners of the room. The way he casually mentioned the house or the land in passing, as if he had already walked through it in his mind, measuring it, claiming it. I had brushed it off for years, excusing it as youthful confidence, a son's casual chatter. But the morning I overheard his conversation with a neighbor, I realized how wrong I had been. He was on the phone, leaning against the railing outside, unaware that I had stepped out to fetch the laundry. The words tumbled from his lips, light and bragging, as if he were recounting some great triumph. "Yeah, the house is mine," he said, "and the land. I'm thinking of selling part of it next spring. Gotta make some room for the investment." I froze mid-step, the basket of laundry clutched in my hands. My stomach churned. Did he really believe it was his already? Had he convinced himself that all the years I had lived here, all the work I had put in, were irrelevant? I pressed my back against the wall, silent, listening to the way his voice carried pride, a smug certainty that the world had already handed him my life. For a long moment, I simply stood there, holding the laundry, letting the betrayal sink in. It wasn't just about the house or the land. It was about recognition, or the lack of it. About a lifetime of love and care reduced to property in the eyes of the child I had nurtured. I remembered mornings when he was little, his face pressed against mine, asking endless questions, full of wonder and fear. Nights when he cried from nightmares, and I had stayed awake, rubbing his back until the tremor subsided. I had raised him with patience and tireless devotion, and yet now he spoke as if none of that had mattered. The house, my memories, the life I had built, it was all invisible to him unless it could be possessed. That evening, he came inside, pretending casual concern, and I watched him as he moved through the rooms. He didn't just look at things, he measured them, as if deciding what could be converted, what could be used, what could be his. My hands trembled slightly as I served him tea, though I forced a calm smile to my face. I kept my tone light, nodding, answering his questions, all the while cataloging his words, his intentions, like a ledger I would never forget. "You know, Mom," he said, casually, "I think it's smart to consider selling the back portion of the land. It's valuable, could bring a good price." I poured more tea into his cup, keeping my expression neutral. "I see," I said softly, the words tasting like ashes on my tongue. After he left that night, I sat alone in the living room, the cat hopping onto my lap and curling against me, her presence steadying, grounding. I realized that I had been blind. I had assumed he would grow into respect, into gratitude. I had assumed he would see me as more than a caretaker or a property owner. But now the truth was undeniable. He saw me as an obstacle, a convenience, and a resource to claim. I thought of the nights I had cried quietly after he had gone to bed, the loneliness of a mother who gave her all and was left with echoes in return. And now, those echoes were joined by the sound of betrayal, ringing clearer than any silence. I traced my fingers along the arm of the chair, feeling the smooth wood, remembering my husband's hands, remembering the effort it took to keep this home together through illness, through struggle. This house was more than walls and beams. It was memory, it was blood, it was history. And Daniel wanted to rewrite it as if none of that mattered. Sleep was restless that night. I lay awake gnawing into the dark hours, the cat curled against my side, purring softly, as if to remind me that loyalty existed still. I thought of the conversations I would need to have, the plans I might quietly enact, and a slow, deliberate calm began to settle over me. I would not be pushed aside. I would not vanish quietly while he calculated his inheritance. There were ways to reclaim power, to ensure that what was mine remained mine. And so I began, in the quiet of my own home, to consider the ways in which he could be surprised, how I could turn his certainty into folly. For now he boasted, he plotted, he measured, but I had time and patience, and the quiet advantage of knowing that while he was eager, I was wise. It was late one afternoon when I discovered the truth I had feared but never fully allowed myself to imagine. I was walking down the hall to retrieve a book I had been reading when I heard voices, Daniel and one of his friends, I assumed, whispering near the living room. At first I thought I had imagined it, but the words drifted clear enough to make my stomach drop.
"Once she's gone, I'm kicking her out," Daniel said. And there it was, plain and cruel, the sentence that confirmed everything I had been suspecting. "The house and the land are mine. I'll get rid of her stuff, maybe even sell the furniture, and it'll be clean." I froze in the hallway, my heart pounding so hard it felt as though it might leap from my chest. His voice was calm, casual even, but the meaning was devastating. He wasn't talking hypotheticals. He was planning my removal, as if I were some piece of furniture to be discarded. I sank silently against the wall, gripping the edge of the doorway. The rage inside me mingled with disbelief, and I felt a deep, aching betrayal that went beyond words. All those years of love, care, sleepless nights, sacrifices, it meant nothing to him, not a shred. And the audacity to speak about it openly, as if I were invisible, as if my presence was irrelevant, made my blood boil. For a long moment, I did nothing but listen, letting his words imprint themselves into my mind. He continued, discussing plans for the house, laughing lightly with the other person about what he would do with the property. Every syllable was like a hammer striking against my ribs. My own son, my child, plotting to erase me from my home, plotting to make my life secondary to his ambitions. When their voices faded, I walked into the living room, pretending to be distracted by a cushion on the sofa, my heart still hammering. My face remained calm, neutral, but inside a fire had begun to burn. I would not confront him, not yet. To confront him now would be to show that he had the power to hurt me, to rattle me. I had lived long enough to know that true power was quiet, deliberate, and often unseen until it strikes. That evening, I made sure to keep the house exactly as I always did, preparing dinner as if nothing had changed, serving him with a smile, asking him about his day in the softest possible tones. He moved around as usual, unaware that I knew, entirely unaware that every word he had spoken about me in those careless whispers had already been etched into my memory. I acted calm, polite, even cheerful, while inside I began to weave the first threads of my plan. Later, I sat alone in the kitchen, the dim light casting shadows across the walls, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea. The cat jumped onto the counter, rubbing against my arm, and I let out a long breath. She had never betrayed me, never plotted against me, never measured my life as a possession to claim. And somehow, the thought of her quiet loyalty gave me strength. I began thinking of the will, of how I might turn his certainty against him. He assumed that everything would naturally become his, that I was too old, too frail to act. But age, I reminded myself, does not equal powerlessness. There were ways to surprise him, ways to reclaim what he thought was his by default. I could outwit him, show him that greed often blinds a person to reality, and that the hands that nurtured him could also protect themselves when necessary. Sleep did not come easily that night. I lay awake, listening to the soft ticking of the clock, tracing the familiar creaks and sighs of the old house that had been mine for decades. It was my sanctuary, my fortress, and I was determined that it would remain so. I would not be driven out, not by Daniel, not by anyone else. He might assume he had power over me, but assumptions are fragile things, and I was about to prove just how fragile his was. By morning, the resolve inside me had solidified into something concrete. I would act, and I would act quietly, deliberately, until the moment came when he realized that nothing he had counted on was guaranteed. He believed he owned what was mine. He was about to learn that ownership, like respect, must be earned, and sometimes defended with cunning rather than confrontation.
I acted as if I knew nothing. I smiled at Daniel when he came in, asked about his day, served him tea, and nodded politely at his casual remarks about the house and land. Every word he spoke about the property, every passing comment about what he would do once it was his, I let roll off me like water on glass.
He saw only the dutiful mother, unaware that behind my calm facade, my mind was working steadily, weaving a plan that he would never see coming. It was strange, this act of pretending. I had spent a lifetime giving, and now giving would not suffice. Now I had to hide my intelligence behind quiet gestures, a smile, a nod, until the moment was right. I cooked the meals he liked, refilled his tea, asked about his work, and listened to him complain about trivial inconveniences as if I were nothing more than a fixture in the background. Every time he said, "Mom, you should really think about selling that side of the land," I nodded as if I were considering it. Every time he joked about rearranging the furniture, I laughed softly. All the while, the fire inside me grew hotter. I began spending my evenings writing, not the will for him, not yet, but a new document, a careful plan for my affairs, one that he could never anticipate. I smiled when I imagined his smug face, his certainty that he would inherit everything, shattering the moment he discovered the truth. My cat became my silent confidant. She would curl at my feet as I worked, her green eyes following every movement, as if approving the plan. It was absurd, almost comical, but the thought gave me a strange satisfaction. For years, I had nurtured Daniel, watched over him, and now, in the quiet of my home, I nurtured the idea of justice in a form he would never see coming. Days passed, and I continued the act. I asked Daniel about his work, listened to his stories, and even offered advice when he didn't expect it. "Have you considered?" I would say, only to smile inwardly as I noted the way he assumed I was merely being motherly. He was blind to the calculations behind every word, the deliberate patience that now defined my actions. He thought he had power over me, but in reality, I had the advantage he could not imagine. One evening, after he had gone out to meet a friend, I retrieved the papers I had been preparing in secret. I held them carefully, the weight of the pen in my hand feeling both absurd and empowering. I had decided, if he assumed that everything would pass to him naturally, it was time to surprise him. And so, slowly, deliberately, I began rewriting my will. Not to Daniel, not to any human who had betrayed my trust. I wrote it in a way that would ensure that what was mine, what had been built and preserved through decades of care, would remain untouchable. The thought of him discovering the truth made my pulse quicken. He had always assumed that my compliance was automatic, that my love was unconditional to the point of surrender. But love, I had learned, does not require surrender. It does not require submission to greed or disrespect. And as I wrote, the cat curled around my legs, watching, her purring steady and rhythmic, I felt a sense of liberation I hadn't known in years. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in bed listening to the house settle, the familiar groans and creaks that had once been comforting, now a soundtrack to my plotting. Daniel had no idea how close he was to losing his assumed privileges, how completely he underestimated the quiet power of the person he had taken for granted. And when sleep finally came, it was heavy and deep, carrying with it a sense of determination. By morning, I had decided fully. I would continue to act the part of the dutiful, unsuspecting mother. I would let him walk through the house, boast about plans, imagine he had control. And all the while, I would continue preparing, quietly, deliberately, until the day came when he would learn that everything he assumed to be his was not only beyond his reach, but safely, cleverly secured elsewhere. The day Daniel attempted to sell the house came with a sense of comic inevitability that I could hardly contain. I watched him stride through the living room with that self-satisfied air he always wore, phone pressed to his ear, voice full of plans and promises, as though the world had already handed him what he thought was his by right. He spoke of contracts, potential buyers, renovations, and profits, completely unaware that the documents I had prepared in secret would render all of his schemes meaningless. I poured myself a cup of tea and settled into the chair by the window, the cat hopping into my lap as if sensing the tension in the air. I let him prattle on, nodding absent-mindedly when he glanced my way, smiling politely, never revealing the truth that lay in my hands. Each word he spoke, each confident assertion, was another brick in the wall I had quietly built between him and the power he assumed he had. When he mentioned the buyer he had lined up, I felt a small thrill of anticipation. "Yes, she seems very interested," he said. "I think we can finalize the deal next week." He sounded triumphant, as though victory were already his. And in that moment, I allowed myself a quiet, inward laugh. The absurdity of his certainty, the blindness of his greed, made the scene almost theatrical. Later that afternoon, when the lawyer he had called arrived at the house, Daniel puffed up with pride, ready to finalize what he assumed was an inevitable transfer of property. I greeted the lawyer with polite civility, smiling, offering tea, and making small talk, all the while feeling a quiet, cold satisfaction settle deep in my chest. He did not suspect that his plans were built on sand, that the foundation he assumed was solid had already been shifted beneath him. When the moment came to sign documents, Daniel reached eagerly for the papers, expecting me to comply without question. I smiled at him, handed the folder to the lawyer, and watched as confusion spread across Daniel's face. The lawyer opened the documents and began to read aloud. The property, the house, the land, everything, carefully and legally designated in my will to my cat. Yes, my cat, the quiet creature who had never betrayed me, never calculated her gain at my expense. The documents were meticulous, legally sound, and impossible to contest. Daniel's face turned pale. He stumbled over words, attempting explanations that faltered and died in his throat. He pointed, argued, gestured, but the lawyer's calm, firm words left him with no recourse. "I'm afraid these are the legal designations, Mr. Daniel," the lawyer said. "The documents were prepared in accordance with all necessary legal requirements. The property belongs to the named beneficiary." I watched, my hands folded neatly in my lap, as he struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. His arrogance, his certainty, his assumptions, all of it collapsed like a house of cards. He looked to me, seeking rescue, pleading silently, but I merely smiled, polite and serene, letting the full impact of his failure settle over him. The cat purred, oblivious to the chaos, her green eyes calm and knowing. And in that moment, I felt an immense satisfaction. Years of betrayal, of unspoken contempt, of casual assumptions about my mortality had been met with quiet, deliberate justice. Daniel had assumed he had power over me. He had assumed he could claim my life, my home, my dignity without effort. And he had been wrong. That evening, after he left in a fluster of disbelief and embarrassment, I sat alone in the living room. The cat curled at my feet, and I traced my fingers along the arm of the sofa, thinking about the years I had lived, the battles I had fought quietly, and the wisdom that had carried me through them. The house, my memories, the life I had built, all of it was safe, protected, not by force of confrontation, but by strategy, patience, and cunning. I realized then that there is a certain beauty in justice delivered quietly, in seeing the arrogance of another undone not by anger, but by deliberate, careful action. Daniel had learned a lesson in humility, in the fragility of entitlement, and I learned again the strength of prudence, of foresight, of quiet resolve. I poured myself a second cup of tea, listening to the house settle around me, to the faint rustle of leaves outside, to the steady purr of my companion. The night was peaceful, the home intact, and I felt a calm I had not known in years. Daniel had lost more than the house. He had lost access to trust, to respect, to the certainty that he could manipulate or claim what was not his. And I, finally, could breathe freely in the place that had always been mine.
The days that followed Daniel's failed attempt to claim the house were quieter than I expected, but the calm was sweet, like the first light after a storm. He still came around, of course, though now his presence carried something heavier, a mix of embarrassment, resentment, and disbelief. I greeted him politely, answered his questions, and listened to his complaints with the same quiet patience I had shown for decades. But beneath the surface, I was no longer the anxious mother who fretted over his approval. I was something steadier now, a woman who had reclaimed her home, her life, and her dignity. I spent mornings walking through the garden, noting the changes in the seasons, the way the light fell on the hydrangeas, the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. My cat followed me loyally, always close, her soft fur brushing against my legs, her purrs steady and comforting. I realized I had been living in a quiet kind of fear for years, always wondering if Daniel would cross some line, take something from me, or assume I was powerless. But that fear had been replaced now by clarity. He had learned, painfully, that I was not to be taken for granted. One afternoon, Daniel came to the door, fidgeting, clearly trying to find some way to assert himself without outright confrontation. I invited him in, served tea as I always did, and listened as he spoke cautiously, asking about mundane things, pretending the battle over the house had never happened. I smiled, nodded, and offered him the politeness he expected, while inwardly noting the change in him. He was smaller somehow, not in stature, but in spirit. His confidence had been replaced by a subtle hesitation, and I found satisfaction in that, though I did not gloat. Justice, I reminded myself, was sweeter when calm and measured, not shouted from rooftops. As the weeks passed, life returned to a rhythm that felt wholly mine. I no longer feared his schemes or his entitlement. The house, the land, the memories, they were secure, safeguarded by my foresight and a touch of cleverness. I moved through my days with a lightness I hadn't felt in years, tending to the garden, reading by the window, listening to the cat's quiet companionship. For the first time in a long time, the home felt entirely like mine again, not just walls and furniture, but a sanctuary of independence and safety. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and the cat resting beside me. The air was soft, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and the faint warmth of lingering sunlight. I thought of Daniel, of his mistakes, of the arrogance that had led him to assume he could claim what was not his. And I thought of myself, not as a victim, not as someone diminished by age, but as a woman who had preserved her life with intelligence, patience, and resolve. I realized that this was the reward for the years I had spent nurturing, protecting, and enduring, a sense of peace, unshakable and profound. Daniel's loss was complete, not just of property, but of the belief that he could manipulate, control, or inherit what he had never truly earned. And I, finally, could breathe freely, knowing that the home I had fought for, the life I had built, and the dignity I had maintained were secure. I sipped my tea, feeling the warmth spread through me, and watched as the cat's tail flicked lazily in the fading light. There was laughter in the wind, gentle and unassuming, and I smiled softly, a quiet, full smile. Life, I realized, had returned to me not by confrontation or anger, but by patience, cleverness, and the quiet assertion of my own will. And in that moment, sitting on the porch, with the house safe, the garden alive, and the cat purring at my side, I knew that I had won something far greater than the property Daniel had coveted. I had won the proof that respect, loyalty, and love are never to be taken for granted, and that even in the face of betrayal, a determined heart can reclaim everything it holds dear. I leaned back, letting the soft wind brush across my face, and whispered into the dusk, "This is my home, mine, entirely mine." The cat purred again, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt completely, irrevocably at peace.